let's begin, if it's okay, with what I'm sure you have been asked many times, which is to sort of start with the basic assumption for us. Many people here will know more than that, but for those of them who don't, tell us about the two hemispheres of the brain and how they each have a different perception of the world.
Yes. This is a difficult topic because people either know something that is entirely wrong or know that the whole subject is wrong. And so it's very difficult to get people to listen, was initially, but I'm very glad to say that I've carried the day with a lot of people. Many of you, if you don't know my work, will think, if you know anything about hemisphere difference, that the left hemisphere is rather boring but reliable. It's like a decent accountant. It keeps good records, but it's not actually great company. And the right hemisphere is this flighty thing that is given to fits of passion and painting. And this is not a good way to think about it at all. There were some conclusions drawn from some early procedures in which the brain was split. There's a band of fibers at the base of the brain that joins these two hemispheres, a bit like a walnut, called the corpus callosum. And for certain people who had intractable epilepsy, a curable condition it became when they were able to divide the two hemispheres one from another, so that if there was an electrical storm, if you like to think of it that way, in one hemisphere, it didn't spread to the other, so the person was able to remain conscious and carry on functioning. And after that, there were a lot of rather interesting experiments that could be done. You could address things purely to one hemisphere or to the other. And on the back of that, the sort of myth that I mentioned grew up. And between the 70s and the 90s, people experimented more and more, and they found that, in fact, all these cliches were completely wrong. And so they gave the whole thing up as a bad job. But I'd like to suggest that that was dogmatic and premature. First of all, the brain consists only in making connections. It's lots and lots and lots, billions of neurons, nerve cells that connect, and its power consists in the connections. So why would nature have endowed us with a brain that had a whopping divide down the middle with just a small connection between the two? That's the first thing. The second is that the brain is asymmetrical. Why would it be asymmetrical? The skull is not asymmetrical. The world around us doesn't divide neatly into a left world and a right world. So why would the brain? And the third, which was something I discovered in medical school, was that this corpus callosum, this connecting band, spent at least half its time, if not more, sending messages to the other hemisphere: you keep out of this, I'm dealing with it. So it wasn't so much necessarily facilitating as inhibiting. And just as an aside, primates have more inhibitory neurons than any other mammal, and humans have more inhibitory neurons than any primate. In fact, about 19% of the human brain consists in inhibitory neurons, which would take us somewhere that we may or may not go, which is the important part that resistance, negation, plays in creation. Anyway, there we are. So that's the first problem. And then I started to look at the literature, and I was fortunate enough to come across a colleague who'd been working in that area for 20 years, John Cutting. And effectively what he had found is that there were significant differences, but they didn't follow the map, reason and language, emotion and pictures, for example, because it's quite true that both are involved in both. But now each of them involved in all those things, in everything that they do, in a different way. So it was not about the what, but about the how. You see what I mean? And that actually turns out to be very, very important. So they each contribute to reason and language and emotion and so on. And the left hemisphere is not, unbiased and unemotional. It's actually prone to anger and aggression. It's very far from being calm. It also tends to jump to conclusions more than the right hemisphere, which Ramachandran, a great neuroscientist, has called the devil's advocate. Anyway, what my research is over 30 years and my collaboration with John Cutting in the initial phases of that reveal is that these two manners of being in the world that these hemispheres bring for us are to do with the way in which we attend. Now, that may not sound very exciting. In fact, when I first realized that the basic thing here was attention, the penny didn't immediately drop. Just, well, attention, it could be memory, it could be, calculation, it could be anything. What's special about attention? Well, the answer is that attention is actually how our world comes into being. We can only know the world we experience, and how we experience that world depends fundamentally on the type of attention. So if you attend to something in one way, you see one thing. If you see it attend in another, you see something quite different. And I sometimes talk about a mountain behind my house. I live at a place called Talisker on Skye, which is not actually where the whiskey is made. It's nearby. They try to keep it out of my reach. It's 4 miles away. But it's called that because it's from a Norse word, Talisker, which means the sloping rock. Now, what that tells you is this mountain, which is a very extraordinary mountain, it has this sloping silhouette from the sea. So what one knows is to the Vikings 1,000 years ago, what that mountain meant was safety or danger, because it alerted them to the fact that they were in a very treacherous piece of water there, and the bay was full of rocks. But we also know there were Picts living there 1,000 years earlier than that. And they have their brochs, the ruins of their brochs are still there. And to them, this mountain offered both shelter and was the home of the gods. Then in the 18th century, people started visiting Scotland to draw it and see the beauty and the sublime landscape. And so for them, this mountain was a many-colored, many-textured form of great beauty. And in the 19th century, people got much more interested in geology for the first time. And it happens to be an extraordinarily good example of columnar basalt formation, the same as it is, in fact, in line with the Giant's Causeway in Ireland. And so it's part of the same formation. To somebody who wanted to mine basalt, this mountain means money, dollars. To a physicist, what it is 99.99% nothing. And in the other 0.01%, we don't really know what's going on. Now, which of these is the real mountain? Which of those is the real mountain? They're all real mountains. They just depend on the way in which and the goals with which we approach it. Everybody sees what they are interested in finding, and the way they attend makes all the difference. So basically, attention helps shape the world. And these two kinds of attention came about for an evolutionarily important reason. I should say that it's not just the human brain that is asymmetrical. All the brains of all the creatures we've looked at, birds, reptiles, amphibians, insects, they all have ganglia or prototype brains that are distinct, left and right, and asymmetrical. And even the oldest extant organism, Nematostella vectensis, 700 million years old, off the Isle of Wight, where it blends in very well with the average age of the community. It has an asymmetrical neural network, and it's been described as the origin of the mammalian brain. So there's something there that seems to involve all living things that requires this asymmetry. What was it? It's that every creature has to solve this conundrum. How can I eat and yet stay alive? Now, that doesn't sound difficult to you, but if you think back for most of history, a creature has to be able to target something and follow it with its eyes and get it very accurately. And to do that, it has a very narrow attention. But if that's the only attention it's paying, it won't last very long, because it won't see the predator overhead. It won't see its mate and its offspring that also need feeding. So there needs to be two kinds of attention, and so different are these kinds of attention that they can only come about by having two centers of awareness. And the left hemisphere has this very narrow beam, perhaps 3 degrees out of the 360, targeted on a detail you can see very precisely. It fixes it and it grabs it. And the left hemisphere controls the right hand with which most of us do the grabbing and the getting. Whereas the right hemisphere has this broad, open, sustained, vigilant attention, which is on the lookout for everything else without preconception. So on the one hand, you've got an attention that produces a world of tiny fragments that don't seem connected to one another, a bit here, a bit there, a bit elsewhere, that are decontextualized, that are disembodied, abstract, become examples of a category of things, and are fixed by the stare of the left hemisphere. So you've got these static, fixed, known, familiar bits and pieces. Oh, it's one of those, that's what I eat. Oh, it's one of those, and so on. Whereas with the right hemisphere, we see that nothing really is completely separated from everything else, or indeed from anything else, ultimately. That all is, at some level, seamlessly interconnected, that it's flowing and changing rather than fixed and static, that everything is what it is because of the context it finds itself in, that embodiment is essential to the nature of what we're looking at, both our looking and the thing we're looking at, that there are unique individuals, that it's not just person, but it's Sue or Fred or whatever it is. Those distinctions, the uniqueness, is something the right hemisphere sees, but the left hemisphere sees just an example of something it uses and needs. The left hemisphere's world is thus a lifeless, literally inanimate kind of a world, and the right hemisphere's one, an animate one. And you can, in fact, now temporarily disable one hemisphere at a time in an experimental subject completely painlessly. And when you do that, you find that the left hemisphere sees things that are animate as mechanisms. When you have the right hemisphere alone functioning, it sees things that you would normally think of as inanimate as alive. So the sun is alive, it's moving across the heavens, it's giving warmth. So these are very, very fundamentally different ways of looking at things. And the last thing I'm going to say is that, and again, this may not strike you as so fundamental, but believe me, it is the right hemisphere sees things as they come into being for us. I use the term presence, they presence to us, which is a term philosophers use translating Heidegger's Anwesen. And what he was getting at was that things are not just given, static, there, but they come about for us as we look at them and pay attention to them, and we see more what they are. They become what they are for us. And that's not to say that it's all made up by our minds. It's not as simple as that, nor is it that there's just a world out there and it's completely passive. There is an interrelationship between our minds and the world that is all the time constructing it. The right hemisphere is aware of this and is part of it. The left hemisphere sees representations, which literally means present again after it's no longer present. So the right hemisphere's world is the world in which we live. The left hemisphere's world is, if you like, a map, a schema, a diagram, a theory, something two-dimensional. And it's got none of the richness that's in the right hemisphere's world. There's nothing wrong with that, because actually a map is very useful. And a map doesn't get more useful by including more and more detail about the names of the people who live in the houses and the plants they grow in the garden. No, a map, to be useful, has to be selective. And that's how it is. So we've got this one world, which is composed of things that are mechanical, useful, inanimate, reducible to their parts, abstracted, decontextualized, dead. And another world which is flowing, complex, living, changing, and has all the qualities that make life worth living for us.
Thank you.